This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoy this critical thought, your daily discussion on game design. And be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and you can pitch future critical thought topics. Alright everybody, this week I'm basically going to be dedicating part of this to Nintendo. As you know, Nintendo Switch is due out in a few days, and I have a few major topics I want to talk about. And if there's any major ones regarding Nintendo you'd like me to cover in the future, please let me know below. But we need to talk about the history of Nintendo, and it's going to be impossible not to sound like a dick when talking about Nintendo's history. And the thing is, you have to understand is that Nintendo has made some major a-hole-ish decisions in their time. And that's not being hyperbole. They have made some decisions that have pissed off a lot of people. And for today's critical thought, we're going to talk about the time Nintendo basically pissed off the entire game industry. And you have to understand that Nintendo is a company that has made some major transitional or company-wide shifts over the years. And Nintendo of today, or more specifically, Nintendo of 2002, when Iwata took over until his tragic passing last year, is a completely different company to what it was during the 90s and before that. And the reason had to do with Nintendo's chairman at that time, Hiroshi Yamauchi, who I am apologizing if I just butchered his name at all there. And Hiroshi took over Nintendo in about 1949 and was a major force in transferring Nintendo from the company that simply made Hanafuda cards into the mega rich company that created the NES and saved the game industry. And what's kind of interesting about his story is that reports have said that he didn't really care about video games, or he didn't really play them at all. And instead, he basically left that to his managers and the people below him. But what Hiroshi understood was business. And people report him being a very shrewd negotiator and the kind of guy that you do not want to piss off at the bargaining table. And keep that in the back of your mind, as we'll be talking more about that in the next few minutes and probably over the next few days. But when Hiroshi took over and made that transition, of course Nintendo went from making the cards to doing simple electronics with the Game & Watch, before of course making the Famicom and the NES. And you have to understand that this was a huge deal, and Nintendo's contribution to the game industry and to its legacy will never go away because of that. Because it was thanks to them we still have video games today. And at some point we need to talk about the game industry crash of the 80s. But after the NES came out and sort of secured Nintendo, this became the period where Nintendo was basically king of the game industry. And that is not hyperbole. This was their most profitable and their most powerful time for basically ever at this point. What happened was you either worked with Nintendo or you didn't make video games. That was about it. And while there were some other games out there, I know there was a PC, there's like a kind of like a PC gaming system in Japan at the time, the TurboGrafx, I believe, and of course the Sega Master System. Nintendo basically ran unopposed in the United States from 1985 to about like 1989 when the Sega Genesis came out. And we'll be talking more about Sega in a few minutes. But during this time, Nintendo was it. You were not going to do anything without Nintendo's supervision and their control. And that has been one of the major tenets of Nintendo. They want control. And they will do anything they can to make sure that they keep 100% of whatever they do. And like I said, keep that one in the back of your mind, because we'll be talking more about that tomorrow. And following the success of the NES, you have to understand just how big of a deal it was for the NES to come out, and basically gave Nintendo pretty much 100% control of the home market in the United States. And that control gave them a massive amount of clout when it came to working with publishers and developers. And this is what led to them pissing everybody off. And originally, with the NES, you had the cartridge system. Put the cartridge in, the game works. And Unfortunately, I don't understand too much about the hardware side of things, but once you knew what was going on in the cartridge, you could take this to an electronics manufacturer or a hardware manufacturer, and they would be able to replicate it. Then simply, of course, putting your game code in the memory, put in the system, your game works. But this is when Nintendo made one of many of their controversial decisions. And again, this is one of those strange things about Nintendo is, from the outside, and even during the 2000 era, Nintendo was always seen as, this fun, happy-go-lucky company. They're the house of Mario. Nintendo Direct of the last decade, painted Nintendo as, like the Willy Wonka of the game industry, this magical place where fun happens. But you have to understand, Nintendo was cutthroat. And a lot of what I learned about came from this book, Game Over, which I got this, I think, during the time of I want to say GameCube was when I got this book. And it is a very great read about the history of Nintendo till about, I think, like 2000 or 1999. So if you ever wanted to see sort of the untold story of Nintendo and what really became the basis for these critical thoughts this week, definitely take a look at this book. But, like I said, Nintendo was cutthroat when it came to the business table. And what that meant was they wanted as much money as possible. And what they did was basically say, you cannot manufacture your games. Only we can print out cartridges which you can then sell. And how they did that was very simple. They created a security chip for the NES that it had to read the correct information on the NES cartridge's security chip in order for the cartridge to work. They don't sync, your game doesn't work. And Nintendo was the only one who had the software, the code for that. But that won't be the case, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes today. But this control basically meant that it didn't matter what your game was, didn't matter how many games you wanted to make, you had to run it through Nintendo. You essentially had to license your game to Nintendo, and then they would manufacture those cartridges. And remember, this was long before digital distribution was anything but a fever dream for most people. There was a quantitative amount of games you could ship. And as we learned during the crash of the 80s, the overabundance of cartridges and software led to a complete falling out of the market and consumer confidence. So Nintendo had complete and utter control. And what that meant was, your game was basically in Nintendo's hands. It didn't matter if you had the greatest NES title of all time if there was only 10,000 copies of it for the entire United States. And then Nintendo went a step further. They charged developers to print the cartridges. And they did, of course, like any major manufacturer, in bulk. So, 5,000 cartridges, 10,000, 20,000, stuff like that. But you have to understand, this is how Nintendo made a ridiculous amount of money. And I know there are a lot of people who, of course, there are critics who will say, Nintendo's profits are down this year, or Nintendo is hurting. But you have to remember, my mouth just completely dried out there. During that period in the late 80s, Nintendo was king. They were double dipping on just about everything related to the video games. You had to license your game to Nintendo, so there was a fee for that. And then for every cartridge that was printed, Nintendo made money off of that as well. And this was a huge deal, because Nintendo basically had a win-win going. If your game was immensely popular, like Dragon Warrior, or I'm trying to think of some other big name examples, Final Fantasy, well then, people are going to want more cartridges, which means you had to go back to Nintendo and pay them more money. But let's say your game was horrible. Let's say everyone hated your video game, but you still printed 5,000 copies of it. Well, Nintendo already got paid for that. They don't care. And this also led into issues with manufacturing. Because let's say your game did do really well, and you want more copies. Well, Nintendo may be busy making some other game. Maybe they're busy working on Super Mario Bros. 3. Well, they're not going to have time for you. So maybe they'll get around to printing your 5,000 copies in 3 or 4 months. And I'm sure people will still be interested in the game then. And this control really pissed off a lot of developers. And as time went on throughout the late 80s, Nintendo realized that they were still seeing some profit loss because so many games are being released that, of course, they weren't all great qualities, and we could spend 5-10 minutes about some of the stinkers of the NES library. So then they issued the second edict that pissed everyone off. They made it so that companies had a limit of how many games they could release in a single year. Now just imagine that along with the limit of copies happening today. Imagine if Steam said, oh, your game did well. Well, we're only going to give you 6,000 Steam keys. Would you like more? Well, you're going to have to pay us for that. And we'll get them to you in a few months. I'm sure, you can wait until March for your game for more copies. I'm sure everyone will be happy with that. And this edict just really made everyone furious. And this was when we started to see this pushback against Nintendo. The first came with the idea of setting up dummy companies. What few of the major publishers did was basically create a second company. The copyright would be attached to them, it would be a subsidiary of them, and they would send the information to Nintendo saying from this company. So that way, if Konami had, let's say, a limit of 3 games they could release a year, well, their subsidiary of Ultra Games would be able to release another 3 games. And famously, a little known game called Metal Gear was released under the Ultra Games brand. And this was a way of, again, getting more games out instead of, abiding by Nintendo's wishes. And another major part of this came with Tengen. And for those of you who don't know what Tengen is, this was a subsidiary of Atari. And Atari really pissed off Nintendo. What they did was figure out a way to crack the security code. And by doing so, they were able to get around needing Nintendo to manufacture those cartridges. And this is why a lot of the Tengen cartridges for their NES games looked dramatically different than Nintendo, because they were manufacturing themselves. And I believe Nintendo even went as far as suing them by, saying that they broke their copyright, they broke their code, and I believe Tengen or Atari won that case. But again, this was the sign that developers were really getting tired of Nintendo and their laws. And like I said, this was Nintendo at their most profitable and their most powerful. And a lot of people went along with it, because even with the restrictions, even with the control of Nintendo, they were still making money hand over fist. Now, of course, during this time, Nintendo also had control over what content could be put into their games. There is the famous example of Castlevania with the boomerang that was originally a holy cross, and of course removing symbols of Christianity in the game. Later on with the SNES era, Nintendo removed the blood from Mortal Kombat, and this would set up Sega to have a major advantage in the home market. And before we go for today, Sega became a very big deal. And I know we can arguably say that in the grand scheme of things, Sega's top games didn't really stand on the same level as Nintendo's top games. But what Sega did was provide competition. And while the Sega Master System, oh, my mouth is getting dry again, did not make that big of a dent in the United States, the Sega Genesis was huge. This was a time during the famous campaign of Sega does what Nintendo don't, and Sonic the Hedgehog becoming a very popular mascot character. But what made Sega a very important part of the game industry is very simple. They provided an alternative to Nintendo. It was no longer the ball was 100% Nintendo's court, that you either work with them or you didn't release your game. Now you had options with Sega. And Sega and Nintendo became hated rivals. From reports from Game Over there and impressions throughout, they despised each other and would throw the other one under the bus given the opportunity. And this kind of rivalry led into a hardware arms race between the two, as they were trying to become the next big thing, or have that next big marketing point that would say, don't go to the other guy, we have this. And this arms race led to Nintendo making the absolute worst decision of their lives. And quite frankly, it cost them the game industry. And I don't mean that hyperbolically. I mean, they basically threw out their dominance. And we're going to talk about that one tomorrow. That's right, we're doing cliffhangers this week. So, thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. Once again, if you enjoyed things, be sure to like and subscribe. If you have a suggestion for a Nintendo topic to cover, let me know below. I don't want, spend an entire month doing Nintendo stuff, but they can always be thrown, in, here and there kind of thing. And be sure to check back tomorrow for more great content here and on GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. Because it is GDC week this week, the website won't be having as many, interesting or unique pieces, but I'll still have some daily coverage. But until tomorrow, have a great rest of the night, and I'll see you all then. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.